Chapter 12. A Peculiar Contract. As Nancy dashed out the door of the building after the thief, she saw Bess heading for the dancing school. "Hurry! Watch the children! I have to catch a thief!" Nancy's ankle was still painful, and she was not able to run so fast as Mrs. Judson, who disappeared around the next corner. Reaching the intersection, Nancy looked for her in vain and concluded Mrs. Judson had gone through one of the stores to another street. As Nancy paused, she became aware of people staring at her. The sight of a girl in a scanty ballet outfit on a business street had attracted considerable attention. Several storekeepers had come outside, and a prim elderly spinster who clerked in the rare old volumes bookshop looked with frank disapproval at Nancy. "Shocking!" the young detective heard her say. "Running around the streets in clothes like that! What is this town coming to?" Nancy blushed in spite of herself. Several of the men snickered, but when Nancy explained that she was trying to catch a thief, they instantly offered to help search for Mrs. Judson. But in a few minutes, they all returned to report that the woman had vanished. "I guess there's nothing more I can do," said Nancy, disappointed. "Thank you all very much." Turning, she walked back quickly to the dancing school. Her young pupils were talking excitedly to Bess, trying to explain about the witch who had taken the slippers. Their tense faces relaxed at sight of Nancy, and eagerly they asked what had happened. "I didn't catch the woman," she said, "but we'll recover the slippers someday." "Miss Fontaine will feel bad if you don't," Susie spoke up. "She just loves those slippers." "When's our teacher coming back?" Carol asked. "I don't know exactly," Nancy replied, "but soon, I hope." Bess led the children into the practice room and continued the lesson. Nancy, meanwhile, telephoned the police about the theft and waited hopefully the rest of the afternoon for news from them. No report came, and Nancy kept trying to figure out what could be so significant about the ballet slippers that would make Mrs. Judson steal them. There must be some good reason, she concluded. Tonight I'll drive out to see the Fontaines. Maybe they'll know the answer. She got in touch with George, who promised to relieve her as receptionist at the school that evening. "And don't let that Judson woman get you down, Nancy," George advised. When Nancy reached home, she found her father already there. He readily agreed to accompany her to Cedar Lake. "I learned a few things today that the Fontaines may be able to shed some light on," he said. "I talked with the airline stewardess who was on that plane you and Koff took. She told me one of the passengers spoke with a decided French accent, but his name wasn't French. He was listed as Raymond Bull. Furthermore, this Mr. Bull also got off the plane at River Heights." "Raymond Bull?" Nancy repeated. Immediately her mind went to the letter R on the palette knife. Could he be an artist friend of the Judsons? "After I learned this," Mr. Drew went on, "I phoned all the hotels and guest houses in town, but no one named Raymond Bull was registered at any of them." "It's probably an assumed name," Nancy commented, and her father nodded. When the Drews arrived at the Nickerson Lodge 2 hours later, they found the Fontaines seated in rocking chairs on the front porch. Hélène and Henri greeted their friends effusively, said they were enjoying their hideaway, and asked for news on the progress of the case. Regretfully, Nancy told them of the unpleasant incident at the dancing school that afternoon. "Oh, my darling slippers!" Helen exclaimed, and tears sprang to her eyes. "I'm sure we'll get them back," said Nancy. "Tell me, Hélène, have you any idea why Mrs. Judson stole your mother's ballet slippers?" "No, none." "Do they have any special value besides the sentimental one?" At this question, Henri leaned forward. "They may have," he answered. The slippers appeared in a portrait that has a curious story to it. "Please tell me," Nancy requested. "Nearly 2 years ago," Henri began, "while I was still doing portrait work, a man by the name of Thomas René came to me. He ordered 12 pictures of a dancer in various ballet poses. It took me 6 months to complete the paintings." "And the slippers?" Nancy prompted. "Hélène posed for me, and in the last picture she wore the scarlet slippers. In the others she wore her own pink ones." Hélène said wistfully, "I resemble my mother, and in one pose Henri declared I reminded him so much of her that he wanted me to wear her scarlet slippers. My costume was a dreamy pale pink, almost white," Hélène went on, gazing off over Cedar Lake. Then, looking at the group again, she said, "My poor brother had so much trouble over those paintings. Tell Nancy and Mr. Drew about it, Henri." The young man weighed the suggestion for several seconds, then said, "The story is an ugly one, but it may possibly shed some light on the mystery, so I will tell you." As he paused, Nancy remarked, "Monsieur René's name begins with R, so I suppose he may be considered a suspected owner of the palette knife?" "I suppose so," said Henri, "except that he was an art dealer, not a painter so far as I know. Well, to tell you the story, the first strange thing which happened was that Mr. René put a peculiar paragraph in our contract. The whole transaction was to be kept a secret, and I was not to sign the paintings." "That was odd," Nancy murmured. "For keeping the secret," Henri continued, "I was to be paid an attractive price. I could not afford to turn down the offer." "Did he give any reason for the secrecy?" Nancy asked. "He said that there was a race among dealers to fill an order from a famous dancing school for 12 paintings. Monsieur René wanted no one to know that he was entering this race." Henri went on to say that according to René, the idea had originated with his wife. She fancied herself to be a great ballet dancer and wished to model for the portraits. "But didn't you say Hélène posed for the pictures?" Mr. Drew put in. "Indeed she did," Henri said quickly. "When this Madame René came to my studio, I was amazed. She was a miserable dancer. And as for posing, she could not hold any of the positions for more than a few seconds. Finally, I had to tell Monsieur René this, and said I would prefer giving up the work. But he would not agree to this. He insisted that we must complete the paintings in secret, and would permit my sister to be the model." "I'm sure that was a relief," Nancy said, smiling. "In a way it was," Henri agreed. "But Mrs. René was very jealous, and said that her husband's visits to our studio were only for the purpose of seeing Hélène. I was very glad when the work was finished." "He was very unattractive," said Hélène, "tall and gaunt and had piercing eyes." "Did Mr. René win the art dealer's race?" Mr. Drew asked. "I don't know. Just as I was finishing the last picture, the warning note came telling Hélène and me to flee the country." Nancy asked if the Fontaines had ever thought of the possibility of a connection between René and the strange note. "Not at the time," Henri replied, "but now I think there might have been." The young detective felt that there was a very good chance of this. Turning to her father, she said, "Dad, do you think you could find out more about Thomas René?" "It may take a little time," the lawyer replied. "But my attorney friend, Mr. Scott, happens to be in Paris at the moment. I'll cable and ask him to track down this new suspect." As Nancy glanced at her watch, Henri said, "Oh, please do not leave yet. This is an opportunity for me to continue work on your portrait, Nancy. Please pose for a while." Nancy looked at her father, who said he was not in a hurry, so his daughter went indoors with the artist. While Henri was working, Mr. Drew wrote out the cable and used the lodge telephone to send it to Mr. Scott. It was nearly midnight before the Drews finally said goodnight. Both were pleased with the progress on Nancy's portrait and felt that Henri was a very talented young artist. "It'll be my Christmas present in advance," Mr. Drew declared enthusiastically. Home once more, Nancy tumbled wearily into bed. The following morning, she found that Hannah did not feel well and suggested that the housekeeper remain quiet. "I'll take over," Nancy offered. "That would be a big help." Hannah smiled. As she made beds, tidied up the house, and did the marketing, the girl detective kept trying to fit the pieces of the Fontaine puzzle together. 3 people had the initial R: Raoul Judson, Raymond Bull, and Thomas René. Was there any connection among them? And were the names their own or aliases? And what did the strange number in the figurine and on the stamp of the Parisian letter have to do with it all? At 11 o'clock, the telephone rang. Nancy answered. Her father was calling from his office. "I have some interesting news for you," he said. "About Thomas René?" Nancy asked excitedly. "That's right," Mr. Drew replied. "But I'd better not give it to you over the telephone. I suggest you come down here at once so we can talk about it." End of chapter 12.